Hi, I'm Josh, and I am so grateful that you've chosen to spend some of your very valuable time with me as I talk about the board games that I played in the month of January 2023. And I have to say, I got the year off to a great start, having played 10 different games throughout the month, so let's get straight into it. Before I dive into those 10 games, I want to start off with a bit of an honorable mention here. Now, one of my pet peeves when it comes to board gaming is players who take an excessive amount of time thinking about their turn, which in the hobby we term analysis paralysis. I'm guessing it comes from players who are more concerned about winning the game than actually enjoying the game experience, or maybe they lack a bit of self-confidence and don't want to look dumb if they make suboptimal moves or don't end up doing particularly well in the game. Whatever it is, it tends to impact the play experience of the others around the table because everyone else is just kind of sitting around waiting for the player to do their thing. Now, having said that, I think that all of us gamers have games that trigger our analysis paralysis, or our AP. And for me, there are a couple of games that do that. One is word games. Games like Scrabble or Hardback, which is on my shelf here, are games that I have a hard time playing quickly. I always feel like, yeah, I can come up with a nice simple word that scores me a low amount of points, but it always seems if only I can think long and hard enough, I can come up with something perfect and amazing with all the letters I have in front of me. And that leads me to stress about how long I'm taking and making other people wait for me. There are a couple other games. Chess would be an example. Because of the huge decision space that is involved in chess, it tends to really slow me down. I remember way back in the day, there was a game called Dungeon Twister, which I really enjoyed the game, but it broke my brain, and there was so much moving pieces and interconnecting things happening on the game board that all of my turns took ages. And it was funny, my now ex-wife at the time, it was the one game she just flat out refused to play after the first time we tried it, because it had a similar effect on her, where it was just like, there's just too big a decision tree going on here. It's just overwhelming and hard to get into. So yeah, we all have those games that trigger that AP. Now, I bring all that up because some years back, I was at a game convention with my buddy Paul, who I tend to play all my games with here nowadays. And we played one of my favorite little games that's strictly for two players, and that is Acrotiri. And I remember at the time, Paul just struggled to kind of make it come together, and it took ages for him to kind of plan out each turn, because there's this really interesting spatial stuff that's going on as you play the game here. And so after that, I thought, okay, this is maybe not a game I want to play with Paul in the future, because obviously it's causing him some anguish and some difficulties. But fast forwarding now years later, where Paul is basically my only adult gaming friend, and I'm just kind of wanting to get back to Acrotiri, and so I thought in January that I would suggest it as an option for one of our game days. And what kind of made me chuckle was Paul just flat out turned it down, and the text he sent back was, "This game breaks my brain." And I was like, yeah, true, I do remember that, and that's fair enough. We all have games like that. So although I did try to get Acrotiri to the table again, and although it is just an amazing little game, it didn't happen to work out this time, and it's understandable. I certainly do not blame Paul for that. Now, talking about the 10 games we actually did play, going in order of my lowest rated game to my highest rated game, we'll start off with a game called Star Wars: The Clone Wars, which is one of the now many variations of Pandemic that are floating around out there. Pandemic was one of the first cooperative board games to really blow up the popularity of cooperative board gaming. Yes, there were other cooperative games that had come out prior to Pandemic, but Pandemic was the one that really kicked off the whole co-op craze. And I owned the original Pandemic when it was first released. Myself and my ex-wife played it a ton. Eventually, I kind of burned out on it. Having played it a bunch, I sold off the base game, the original game of Pandemic. But then when Pandemic Legacy Season 1 was released, I purchased that game and ended up having some of the best experiences I've ever had in board gaming playing through Pandemic Legacy Season 1. But then after we had played over a dozen plays to get through that campaign, once again I was burned out on Pandemic. Some time passed, and then Pandemic Legacy Season 2 was released, and I ended up picking up that game, playing through the entire campaign. And although it wasn't as good as Season 1, it was a game I enjoyed quite a bit. Once again, of course, by the end of it, I was done with Pandemic, had gotten rid of it. Time passed again, and another version came out called Pandemic Fall of Rome. More about that shortly here. And all of a sudden now I had a historical theme that was very interesting to me, and they had taken the base structure of Pandemic and tweaked it to make this whole historical theme come to life, and it was done in such a clever way, and it was so interesting I decided to pick up Fall of Rome, and I've owned it ever since. Now, getting back to the Clone Wars here, this is a game that Paul had acquired, and so he brought it over and we gave it a shot, and it turns out that Star Wars The Clone Wars is a very simplified version of Pandemic. It's not one I would necessarily recommend to serious hobby gamers, but it is an ideal version, I think, to play with families. It is a stripped down, simplified, fairly fast playing version of Pandemic that has great little Star Wars minis in it that are really fun to mess around with on the board and whatnot. We ended up playing 2 games back to back, and we won both of them, although the second time we won at literally the last possible second. Basically, I was finishing my last turn, and if we hadn't won during my turn, we would have lost the game. So we managed to squeak out victory there. I ended up rating the game 6 out of 10 because, like I said, it is simplified. The Star Wars theme doesn't appeal to me a great deal, and there's at least one other version of Pandemic I would prefer to play. Paul rated the game 7.5 out of 10. He enjoyed it a bit more than I did. And like I said, it would be kind of an ideal game to play with families, I think. Next up is chess. Throughout the month of January, I played around 5 games of chess. I think they were all with my older son, Evan, because he continues to be interested in the game, which is pretty cool. And he actually played me to a draw twice, which is the closest he's come so far to beating his daddy. So his skill level is definitely improving. Another thing that we tried was I tried Fisher Random Chess, or Chess 960 as it's also called, where there's kind of a randomized, semi-randomized order of the back pieces, all your power pieces that are behind the pawn row, where we ended up rolling various dice, 4-sided, 6-sided, 8 and 12, I think, to determine where specifically the pieces would be arranged so that we would have kind of a random setup in the back row. And it just, it kind of breaks the mold in terms of having to memorize all these openings in chess, because now all of a sudden you have a very different assortment of pieces, and yeah, you're trying to follow the basic principles of playing early game chess, but you are working with a different assortment, so that kind of mixes it up a little bit, makes it a little bit interesting, I think. But for the most part, we played regularly and had fun with it. I rate chess 7 out of 10. Another game that I had rated 7 out of 10, but I've since bumped it up to 7.5 out of 10, is Traders of Osaka. I talked about this game a fair bit when I talked about my 2022 year in review of board games. So if you've seen that, you'll know why I bumped up my rating to 7.5 out of 10. Paul rates the game 7.5 out of 10, and the more we come back to this seemingly simple, innocuous little game, the more little elements of strategy come to bear and make the game all that more interesting. So Traders of Osaka, great little game, and one that we just seem to keep coming back to. Next up is another cooperative game, although despite not being a solo board gamer, I found myself taking out Switch and Signal to play solo and to play around with a bit on my own. I kind of became enamored with this game towards the end of last year as I purchased it and Paul and I played it a couple of times. I ended up winning the game both on the regular side of the board and the reverse side of the board, playing on normal difficulty levels. My next challenge will be to bump up the difficulty slightly, and there are a couple different ways you can do that with Switch and Signal. This is a game that is very simple. Part of its appeal is how approachable the game is, although, like I've mentioned previously, I just don't quite know what the long-term replayability will be for the game. Especially now, having played it solo a couple of times, I've kind of figured out the rhythm or the general strategy you need to follow to be successful in the game. And my concern is that by increasing the difficulty levels, you're just increasing the luck factor that comes into play a bit. So although I kind of have a good idea of how to strategically make the game work. Now I'll be just kind of more up against the luck factor, which I don't know if that's going to be enough to keep my interest over time, but for now I still do really enjoy Switch and Signal, and I rate it 7.5 out of 10, and Paul had also previously rated it 7.5 out of 10. Next up is a little two-player game that is built very much around the mechanism of pick up and deliver, where players are flying a spaceship from planet to planet, picking up goods from one planet, delivering them to another planet to sell them for money, and racing to reach a certain amount of money before the other player does so. Structurally, the game is very similar to another little game called the Great Heartland Hauling Company, in that both are very simple to learn and play. They're both very stripped down pick up and deliver games. Both of them allow players a bit of an option to upgrade their vehicles through acquiring specific technologies that help their vehicles become more efficient, and they're both a race to earn a certain amount of money. So whereas in the Great Heartland Hauling Company you're driving a truck around picking up livestock and produce and delivering it to cities to sell them, in Perry Roden, the Cosmic League, you're flying your spaceship around, picking up goods and delivering them to planets. So both these games are very comparable. I struggle to decide which one I like better, because I've always thought I don't really need both these games in my collection because they fill such a similar niche, but I've really had a hard time deciding which one I would like to get rid of. And ultimately I think that the Great Heartland Hauling Company has just a slight edge over Perry Roden. For one thing, this is a 2 to 4 player game, whereas Perry Roden is strictly a 2-player game, although the designer has released some official printable content that allows you to add a third player, as well as some other interesting expansion content, and those are all kind of officially sanctioned by the designer and available to download and print out if you want to add those to the game. But overall, I think I like the way that you move around a little bit more in the Great Heartland Hauling Company, whereas Perry Roden is just strictly a roll and move thing. Although one thing I like is that every time you roll a 1, you can re-roll and add the 1 to your next roll, and if you keep rolling 1s, you can keep adding them to your movement number. But Heartland here is based around card play. You play gasoline cards to move around, and the board itself is a little bit more interesting. You can add some interesting obstacles and whatnot to work around on the board. So I would give the edge to the Great Heartland Hauling Company, although I think I'd give them both the same rating. I give Perry Roden a rating of 7.5 out of 10, although if it came to ranking, obviously I would rank the Great Heartland Hauling Company slightly higher. Paul rated Perry Roden a 7 out of 10, and actually when we played it, I just squeaked out the most narrow of victories. If I hadn't won the game on my turn, Paul would have won it on his very next turn, so we had a nice close game of Perry Roden. Now back to Pandemic. I told you I would come back to Pandemic Fall of Rome, and I'm happy to say that we also got this one to the table. Like I said, the theme of it is very interesting in that you play as the Romans, and there are all these so-called barbarian tribes, although it's not a great term because really, if you look at it, they are the indigenous peoples of various nations who the Romans are trying to come in to invade and take over their stuff. But because we're playing from the point of view of the Romans, they are the barbarians. But anyhow, so you have all these barbarian tribes who are gradually coming into your territory and trying to capture the city of Rome, and you're trying to kind of hold off those invasions, trying to ally with the different nations and kind of turn back their invasions. So it's a very interesting, very clever take on the Pandemic system. And I went to Etsy and I got these amazing little wooden warrior tokens for all the different barbarian tribes. And they just fit so perfectly with the great little wooden legionary pieces that represent the Roman armies in this game. So all of that was very enjoyable. I rate the game 7.5 out of 10. Paul rates it 8 out of 10, I'm pleased to say. So this was definitely a success, and I was happy to get back to that this month. Moving on up in the rankings then, we get to yet another cooperative game. And once again, this is one that I was dabbling with solo. So way back in December of 2014, I went on Kickstarter and I pledged 145 Canadian dollars to get this game plus its 2 big expansions. And probably roughly about a year later, I got in the mail V-Commandos along with the French Resistance and the other weapons expansion. Now, due to legal reasons, this designer had to change his name from V-Commandos to V-Sabotage. I believe there's a video game called V-Commandos that gave him some legal trouble, so he had to change the name of his game. And he's Canadian. I think he's in Montreal, actually, the designer of V-Commandos. But this has been sitting on my shelf for about 7 or 8 years, and previously I'd only dabbled a bit with the first couple of tutorial missions. And this time in January, I decided I wanted to take the game out, get through the tutorial, and see if I wanted to go ahead and explore the game a little bit more. So I did just that. I got through all the tutorials and really enjoyed the experience. This is a very clever game in that it is all about stealth. So your characters on the game are very much single specific characters with a name and a token representing your character, and you're trying to sneak around these German facilities with all these German guards who are again represented by individual soldiers on the board, and you're trying as hard as possible to use stealth to not get noticed, to accomplish your mission, whatever it might be, and get out of there alive. This box is heavy because it's full of expansion content, so I'm going to put it down. But there are a couple of impressive things about V-Commandos or V-Sabotage. One is that there are 191 round character tokens in the game, little double-sided cardboard tokens that represent our characters as the allied players, plus all the German guards, even some civilians and neutral characters and so forth. But all of these 191 character counters each have a unique piece of art on it. So yes, there are obviously people wearing kind of identical uniforms, but every single one of them is posed slightly differently. There are a lot of different uniform types, and so it's really quite amazing that all of these characters have a unique piece of art on them to represent that individual character. Of course, one nice thing about it, being a cooperative game where you're playing as the Allies, is nobody has to play the bad guys. The Nazis are controlled by the game itself, so we're playing against the German army in the Second World War, and nobody has to take on that particular role, so that's kind of nice. And other than that, it follows a fairly straightforward action point system where there's a whole bunch of different types of actions you can do on the board, but you have just a few actions that you can do per turn, and trying to decide how to use those actions is a major tactical thing you're doing from turn to turn. I do wonder with the missions how different each mission is going to feel from game to game. The game comes, especially with the expansions, comes with a whole bunch of different missions you can play through, which is pretty cool. I don't know how much of it's going to come down to doing your best to sneak around, but having to rely on the roll of dice to see if you are discovered or not. If you do get discovered by the Germans, then the alarm goes off, bad stuff happens, and your mission becomes much more difficult. So that is pretty much determined by the roll of a die, where a roll of 1 or 2 is you were seen by a guard. Roll 3 to 6, you can keep sneaking. So there's a certain amount of luck in that aspect of the game, which is fine. It's a cooperative game. You need that aspect of luck for a co-op game. But from what I've seen through the tutorial, it definitely looks like a game I'd like to explore more, and I rate the game 7.5 out of 10, and will adjust it accordingly as I dive into the actual scenarios. Now, speaking of tutorials, we had in the month of December played Mechs versus Minions with my kids. We had played the tutorial mission, and so in January we played the first real mission, and we beat it quite easily, actually. I think the kids caught on pretty well to how the whole programming your program row goes, where you're drafting cards every turn. The cards allow you to move in different ways or attack in different ways, and you are programming them in your programming row so that turn to turn you start at the beginning and you work through your row, and over time you're going to have more actions and more powerful actions to do, but they're not going to change much in terms of the order you're doing them every turn. So the kids, like I said, got the hang of it pretty quick, and we did pretty well on the first mission. I continue to be blown away by the physical production of this game. It's just pretty wild. And as a family game, I've rated it 8 out of 10 at this point. Just before I get to my top 2 games of the month, let me send out a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters, especially to my higher tier supporters Abe O, my even higher tier supporters Joanna and King Booty, and my highest of all tier supporter Asmonda's Perfect. Your support really does mean the world to me. Thank you very much. And now let me talk to you about one of my top 3 favorite games of all time. That is Mr. Jack, although the version of the game I played is the tiny little Mr. Jack Pocket. Specifically, I played the electronic version on my phone here. There's a really great app version of Mr. Jack Pocket available, and it had been a while since I had played it, and so I decided to give it a shot. I rate this version of Mr. Jack an 8 out of 10. Speaking of analysis paralysis, this is a game that does burn my brain to a certain extent, despite how tiny and innocuous it seems. There is a lot to think about turn to turn in the pocket version of this game that is just so cleverly done and such an interesting take on the whole Mr. Jack system. And then the best of January is another series of games that is amongst my favorite. As you know from watching previous videos, I'm sure I really enjoy Clank and its whole system of games. I rate the base game of Clank and all its expansions 9 out of 10. I rate Clank Legacy Acquisitions Incorporated, the Legacy campaign version of Clank, a perfect 10 out of 10, and regard it as one of my, I guess, tied for #1 games of all time alongside Gloomhaven and Pandemic Legacy Season 1, which are both Legacy games as well. I haven't tried any of the Clank in Space versions of the game at all, but they've recently come out with Clank Catacombs, which is very similar to the original Clank, except it is played on a modular explorable board, where instead of having the entire board in front of you, you are exploring it piece by piece, flipping over a tile, moving on until you get to the edge of it, flipping over another tile, and so forth. It's a concept that very much intrigued me because I love exploration in games. There's just something about having all these face down tiles and being able to flip it over and see what you get, see where you end up. So that is an aspect of gaming that I really enjoy quite a bit. But on the other hand, I thought, I don't know if this would actually improve the game, because while Clank is a highly tactical game in that you're drawing your hand of 5 cards and figuring out how best to use those 5 cards from turn to turn, but the long-term strategic aspect of the game is looking at how the board is laid out and planning a general route to get a specific artifact and then get back out of the dungeon again. I thought, well, now you're taking that aspect of planning and strategy and you're just making it random discoverable tiles, which makes it even more tactical and more random, which I thought, that can't be good, right? But then we sat down and played Clank Catacombs because Paul ended up getting a copy, and I was just so impressed with how it worked out. It turns out that, yes, as you're exploring into the dungeon, you are turning over the tiles and seeing how it all ends up getting built out. But ultimately, you need to plan a route to get back out again, and it's not the easiest thing to do the way the game's designed. There's always a challenge in trying to figure out how you're going to get back out of the dungeon again. So it's interesting that that differs vastly from game to game, because no 2 game states are ever going to end up the same once you have generally finished the exploration part of it. So I ended up loving that aspect, as well as the other little things that they added to the game, like the way lockpicks work and the way you can free prisoners and just the other little things they've kind of thrown in there. I ended up loving it, and I ended up rating Clank Catacombs 9.5 out of 10, and actually Paul did as well. He rated it 9.5 out of 10 too, so it ended up being a huge hit. Now I'm glad Paul owns it, because I already have base game Clank plus all the available expansions for it, so I wasn't in a big hurry to invest in a slightly different version of Clank, but I'm super happy that Paul has a copy, because now anytime we feel like playing Catacombs, we can pull it out and dive back into it again. So that was my month of January. What about you? What games have you been playing? What have been some of your recent favorites? Are there any you've picked up recently and are eager to get to the table? Please get into the comments, carry on the discussion with me. I would love to hear from you. Thanks so much for watching. The preceding video has been brought to you free of charge by me, Josh. The only thing I ask in return is that you could do one of the following: give me a thumb up, push the subscribe button, or share the link to this video with somebody who you think would enjoy it. Cheers. Now, all of us gamers, I think... Now, I'll start with... I will start off with a game called Pandemic... And Another game that I had rated, don't know, designer spot. The kind of camp, kind of invest into my second last game. Now I pulled out my second last game. Oh,